The morning light filtered through the tall windows of Windsor Castle, casting long shadows across the ornate carpet of the private drawing room. King Charles III stood near the fireplace, his weathered hands clasped behind his back as he stared into the dancing flames. The weight of the crown, though not physically present on his head at this moment, seemed heavier than ever before. Today would mark a turning point in his reign, though he had no way of knowing just how dramatically his world was about to shift. Outside, the grounds of Windsor were bustling with quiet activity. Staff members moved with practiced efficiency, preparing for what was meant to be a routine family gathering. The occasion was ostensibly simple, a private lunch to discuss upcoming royal engagements and the ever-present challenges of modernizing the monarchy while maintaining its treasured traditions. Yet beneath the surface, tensions that had been simmering for months were about to reach a boiling point. Charles turned from the fireplace as footsteps echoed in the hallway beyond the drawing room doors. His heart rate quickened slightly, a reaction that had become increasingly common whenever he anticipated seeing his daughter-in-law. Catherine, the Princess of Wales, had become more than just William's wife in Charles's eyes. Over the years since her marriage to his eldest son, she had evolved into something he had never expected, a source of comfort, understanding, and what he was beginning to recognize as genuine emotional connection. The relationship had begun innocently enough. Catherine's natural grace and her ability to navigate the complexities of royal life had impressed Charles from the beginning. Unlike many who entered the royal sphere, she seemed to understand instinctively the delicate balance required between public duty and personal authenticity. She listened when he spoke about his passions for environmental conservation and organic farming. She asked thoughtful questions about his charitable work. Most importantly, she treated him not just as a king or even as her father-in-law, but as a person worthy of genuine care and attention. As the months passed, Charles found himself looking forward to their conversations with an intensity that surprised him. When Catherine spoke, he felt truly heard in a way that had become rare in his life. Her laugh was genuine, her concern authentic, and her presence brought a lightness to his often heavy days. He began to seek out opportunities to spend time with her, initially justifying these moments as necessary for royal business or family obligations. The sound of voices in the corridor grew closer, and Charles recognized Catherine's melodic tone among them. She was speaking with someone, probably one of the staff members, about arrangements for an upcoming charity event. Even through the closed doors, her voice carried the warmth and authority that had made her so beloved by the British public. Charles straightened his jacket and moved away from the fireplace, positioning himself near the window where the light would be most flattering. When the doors finally opened, Catherine entered first, followed by William and, moments later, Camilla. The sight of all three together created an immediate tension in Charles's chest. Catherine wore a navy blue dress that complemented her figure perfectly, her hair styled in an elegant updo that emphasized the graceful line of her neck. She smiled as she entered, that radiant expression that had charmed millions and had begun to hold special meaning for Charles. "Good morning, Your Majesty," Catherine said, offering a slight curtsy that seemed both respectful and intimate. Her eyes met his for just a moment longer than protocol required, and Charles felt that familiar flutter of connection. "Catherine, how lovely to see you," Charles replied, his voice carrying a warmth that didn't go unnoticed by the others in the room. "You look absolutely radiant today." William, who had been adjusting his tie, looked up sharply at his father's tone. There was something in the way Charles spoke to his wife that had been bothering William for weeks. It wasn't anything he could point to specifically. His father had always been courteous to Catherine, but there was an undertone now that made William uncomfortable. Camilla entered the room with her usual confident stride, wearing a cream-colored ensemble that spoke to her position as queen consort. She had learned to read Charles's moods over their long relationship, and she immediately sensed something different in the atmosphere. Her eyes moved quickly from her husband to Catherine and back again, noting the way Charles seemed to light up in the younger woman's presence. "Shall we have some tea before lunch?" Camilla suggested, moving toward the ornate tea service that had been arranged on a side table. "I thought we could discuss the upcoming state visit while we're all together." Charles nodded absently, but his attention remained focused on Catherine, who had moved to examine a new painting that hung near the window. She stood in profile to him, and he found himself captivated by the way the morning light played across her features. There was something ethereal about her presence, something that made the rest of the room seem to fade into insignificance. "This is beautiful," Catherine commented, studying the landscape painting. The brushwork reminds me of the pieces we saw at the gallery last month. You have an excellent eye, Charles said, moving to stand beside her, perhaps a bit closer than was strictly necessary. The artist is someone I've been following for several years. I thought you might appreciate his style. The comment hung in the air with unintended weight. William frowned, processing the implication that his father had chosen this particular artwork with Catherine's tastes in mind. It was another small detail in a pattern that was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. Catherine turned to face Charles, and, for a moment, they stood close enough that he could catch the subtle scent of her perfume. You always seem to know exactly what I'll enjoy, she said with a smile. It's as if you understand my thoughts better than I understand them myself sometimes. The words were innocent enough, but the way she said them, the slight softness in her voice, sent a jolt of electricity through Charles. He found himself leaning slightly closer, drawn by some magnetic force he couldn't name or resist. I've always believed that true understanding comes from genuine attention, Charles replied quietly. And you, my dear Catherine, are certainly worthy of attention. William cleared his throat loudly, breaking the moment. Father, perhaps we should discuss the scheduling conflicts for next month's engagements? Charles stepped back reluctantly, but his eyes remained fixed on Catherine's face. She had blushed slightly at his words, a delicate pink that enhanced her natural beauty. The sight stirred something deep within him, something he had been trying to suppress for months. Camilla watched the interaction with growing unease. She had built her relationship with Charles over decades, weathering scandals and public disapproval to finally achieve the position of queen consort. The idea that her husband might be developing feelings for their son's wife was almost too devastating to contemplate. Yet the evidence was mounting with each passing day. Yes, let's focus on business, Camilla said crisply, taking her seat at the head of the small conference table that had been set up for their meeting. Catherine, I believe you have some thoughts about the children's charity initiatives? Catherine nodded and moved to the table, but not before glancing back at Charles with an expression that seemed to hold unspoken meaning. As she settled into her chair, Charles found himself studying the graceful way she moved, the confident manner in which she carried herself, the intelligence that sparkled in her eyes when she spoke about causes close to her heart. The meeting proceeded with discussions of schedules, public appearances, and charitable commitments. Catherine spoke passionately about several initiatives, her voice animated as she described her vision for expanding educational programs for underprivileged children. Charles hung on every word, occasionally offering suggestions that built upon her ideas in ways that showed he had been giving serious thought to her work. That's a brilliant approach, Charles said after Catherine outlined a new mentorship program. Your instinct for connecting with people on a personal level while maintaining the dignity of the institution is remarkable. It's exactly what the monarchy needs moving forward. William shifted uncomfortably in his seat. While he was proud of his wife's accomplishments, his father's effusive praise was beginning to feel excessive. Moreover, the way Charles looked at Catherine while speaking suggested emotions that went far beyond professional admiration. Catherine has always been dedicated to her role, William said firmly. We both are. Our priority is serving the people and supporting the crown as a team. The emphasis on team was not lost on Charles, who heard the subtle warning in his son's words. For a moment, guilt washed over him. William was right, of course. Catherine was his son's wife, the mother of his grandchildren, and her primary loyalty lay with William and their family. Charles had no right to the feelings that were growing stronger with each passing day. Yet even as his rational mind acknowledged these facts, Charles found his eyes drifting back to Catherine. She was taking notes in a small leather-bound journal, her brow slightly furrowed in concentration. There was something so genuine about her engagement with the work, so pure in her desire to make a positive impact, that Charles felt his heart swell with what he could no longer deny was more than familial affection. Camilla observed her husband's distraction with growing alarm. She had worked too hard and sacrificed too much to lose Charles to what she hoped was merely a midlife crisis. Charles, she said sharply, did you hear my question about the autumn tour? Charles startled slightly, realizing he had been lost in his contemplation of Catherine. I'm sorry, my dear. Could you repeat that? I asked whether you thought we should extend the Australia visit by an additional day, Camilla said, her voice carrying a subtle edge. It would allow for more cultural engagements. Whatever you think is best, Charles replied distractedly, his attention already wandering back to Catherine, who was now discussing timeline details with William. The dismissive response stung Camilla more than she cared to admit. Charles had always valued her input on royal matters, and his sudden lack of interest in her opinions felt like a personal rejection. She watched as his gaze lingered on Catherine's profile, noting the subtle smile that played at the corners of his mouth whenever the younger woman spoke. As the meeting continued, the undercurrents of tension grew stronger. William became increasingly protective in his responses, often interjecting when Charles addressed Catherine directly. Camilla's contributions grew sharper, her patience clearly wearing thin. And Catherine, perhaps sensing the shift in dynamics, began to seem slightly uncomfortable, glancing between the three other people at the table with growing uncertainty. "I think that covers everything for today," William said finally, closing his folder with perhaps more force than necessary. "Catherine, and I should be getting back to the children." "Of course," Charles said, though his tone suggested disappointment at the prospect of Catherine's departure. "But, before you go, Catherine, I wondered if you might have a moment to look at some documents related to the environmental summit. Your perspective would be invaluable." William's jaw tightened. "I'm sure Catherine's schedule is quite full today. Perhaps we could arrange something later in the week?" "Actually," Catherine said softly, seemingly unaware of the tension her words would create, "I'd be happy to take a quick look now. The environmental initiatives are particularly important to me." Charles's face lit up with genuine pleasure. "Wonderful. They're in my private study. It should only take a few minutes." As Charles and Catherine left the room together, their voices fading down the corridor, William and Camilla remained behind in heavy silence. The sound of their footsteps echoed until they disappeared entirely, leaving behind a charged atmosphere that neither William nor Camilla could ignore. "This has to stop," William said quietly, his voice tight with controlled emotion. Camilla nodded slowly, her own concerns crystallizing into a plan of action. "Yes," she agreed, "it certainly does." Meanwhile, in his private study, Charles was experiencing a moment of pure contentment as Catherine examined the environmental proposals spread across his desk. She leaned forward to read more carefully, and he found himself studying the curve of her neck, the way her hair caught the light, the elegant lines of her profile. When she looked up and caught him watching her, neither of them looked away immediately. "Charles," Catherine said softly, "is everything all right? You seem different today." The question hung between them, loaded with possibility and danger. Charles knew he stood at a crossroads. He could deflect, maintain the proper boundaries, and bury his feelings as he had buried so many emotions throughout his life. Or he could take the risk of honesty, even if it meant crossing a line from which there might be no return. "Catherine," he began, his voice barely above a whisper, "there's something I need to tell you." The afternoon sun had shifted, casting new shadows across the room as the moment stretched between them. Outside, the normal rhythms of royal life continued, but inside the study, time seemed suspended as Charles prepared to speak words that would change everything. Catherine's eyes widened slightly as she sensed the weight behind Charles's words. The air in the study seemed to thicken with unspoken tension, and she found herself holding her breath as she waited for him to continue. The environmental documents on the desk between them suddenly seemed trivial compared to whatever Charles was struggling to express. "Catherine," Charles repeated, his voice trembling almost imperceptibly. "These past months, spending time with you, talking with you, watching you navigate this complex world we inhabit, it has awakened something in me that I thought was long dormant." Catherine remained perfectly still, her training as a royal keeping her expression carefully neutral even as her mind raced to process what she was hearing. She had noticed the way Charles looked at her lately, the lingering touches when he helped her with her coat, the way his voice softened when he spoke to her. She had told herself it was merely paternal affection, the natural warmth of a father-in-law who appreciated her dedication to the family and the crown. "Your Majesty," Catherine began carefully, "I'm not sure I understand what you're saying." Charles moved around the desk, eliminating the physical barrier between them. Catherine instinctively took a small step backward, but found herself against the bookshelf with nowhere else to retreat. Charles stopped just close enough that she could see the conflict playing out in his eyes, desire warring with duty, longing battling with loyalty to his son. "I think you do understand," Charles said softly. "I see it in your eyes when you look at me. There's a connection between us, Catherine, something rare and precious that transcends the boundaries of family obligation." Catherine's heart began to race, not entirely from alarm. She couldn't deny that she had felt drawn to Charles in ways that confused and sometimes frightened her. His intelligence, his passion for causes she cared about, his vulnerability beneath the royal facade, All of it had created a bond that she had worked hard to keep within appropriate limits. Charles, she said, using his name without the title for the first time in private. What you're suggesting, it's impossible. I'm married to William. I love William. And you're married to Camilla. Are we talking about love? Charles asked, moving another step closer. Because I haven't felt truly loved, truly understood, truly seen as a complete person in longer than I care to remember. Until you came into my life and showed me what it means to connect with someone on every level, intellectual, emotional, spiritual. Catherine pressed herself back against the bookshelf, her composure beginning to crack under the intensity of Charles's words and proximity. You're speaking as if this is some kind of fairy tale, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. But we live in the real world, where actions have consequences, where duty comes before personal desire. Her natural compassion, the quality that had made her beloved by the British people, made her want to comfort him even as her rational mind screamed warnings. Charles, she said gently, I understand that you're lonely. The pressures you face, the isolation that comes with your position, I see how it weighs on you. But what you're suggesting isn't the answer. It would destroy everything you've worked to build, everything you represent. Would it? Charles asked, reaching out to touch her face. Catherine didn't pull away, and the contact sent electricity through both of them. Or would it be the first truly authentic thing I've done as king? The first time I've chosen love over protocol, happiness over duty. Catherine closed her eyes for a moment, struggling against the temptation his touch represented. When she opened them again, she saw that Charles had moved even closer. His face was inches from hers, and she could feel the warmth of his breath. Think of William, she whispered desperately. Think of your grandchildren. Think of what this would do to them. I think about William constantly, Charles replied. I think about how he is everything I've ever wanted, youth, purpose, and most importantly you. I think about how he takes your devotion for granted because he's never known what it means to live without genuine love and understanding. He doesn't take me for granted, Catherine protested. But, even as she said it, she wondered if it was entirely true. William's dedication to his royal duties had intensified since his father became king, and their private time together had become increasingly limited. Their conversations had grown focused on schedules and obligations rather than the dreams and hopes they had once shared. Doesn't he? Charles asked. When was the last time he looked at you the way I'm looking at you right now? When was the last time he spoke to you about something other than royal business? When was the last time he made you feel like the extraordinary woman you are, rather than simply an efficient partner in the family enterprise? The questions hit closer to home than Catherine cared to admit. Her marriage to William had evolved over the years from passionate romance to comfortable partnership, and while she valued their stability and shared commitment to their children and duties, she sometimes missed the intensity of earlier days. That's how marriages mature, Catherine said, but her voice lacked conviction. People grow and change and learn to love each other in different ways. Do they? Charles asked. Or do they simply settle for less than they deserve because they're afraid to reach for something more? His hand moved from her face to rest against the bookshelf beside her head, effectively trapping her in place while somehow making the gesture feel protective rather than threatening. Catherine found herself studying Charles's face with new attention. She noticed the lines around his eyes that spoke of years of burden and responsibility, the way his mouth curved when he spoke passionately about something important to him, the intelligence that sparkled in his gaze when he was truly engaged in conversation. He was handsome in a way that was different from William's youthful appeal, more complex, more weathered by experience, carrying the depth that came from decades of navigating impossible situations. You're the King of England, Catherine said, as much to remind herself as to remind him. I'm your daughter-in-law. This conversation alone is treason, Charles suggested with a slight smile. I suppose it might be, from a certain perspective, though I prefer to think of it as honesty. When was the last time someone spoke to you with complete honesty about their feelings, Catherine? The question caught her off guard because she couldn't immediately remember. Royal life required such careful management of emotions, such constant awareness of public perception and political implications, that genuine emotional honesty had become a rare commodity in her world. I don't know, she admitted quietly. I do, Charles said. Never. No one speaks to you with complete honesty because they're all afraid. Afraid of overstepping boundaries, afraid of political consequences, afraid of damaging their position or yours. But I'm already the king. I have nothing left to gain and everything to lose. That gives me the freedom to tell you the truth. Which is, Charles took a deep breath, as if steeling himself for a declaration that would change everything. The truth is that you have become the most important person in my life. The truth is that I wake up every morning looking forward to the possibility of seeing you, and I go to sleep every night thinking about our conversations. The truth is that when you smile at me, genuinely smile, not the practiced royal smile, but the real one, it's the highlight of whatever day I'm having. Catherine felt tears prick at her eyes despite her efforts to maintain control. The vulnerability in Charles's voice, the obvious sincerity of his words, moved her more deeply than she had expected. She realized that some part of her had been aware of his growing affection and had perhaps unconsciously encouraged it because it filled a void in her own life that she hadn't wanted to acknowledge. Charles, she said softly, even if what you're saying is true, even if there are feelings involved, we can't act on them. The cost would be too high. Would it? Charles asked. What exactly would we be risking? A loveless marriage for you? A partnership built on duty rather than desire? A life spent pretending that surface-level contentment is the same thing as happiness? We'd be risking everything, Catherine replied, but her voice lacked the firmness she was trying to project. The monarchy, our family relationships, our children's future, the respect of the nation. The monarchy has survived far worse scandals than this, Charles said. And as for our family relationships and our children's future, wouldn't they be better served by adults who are genuinely happy rather than adults who are merely fulfilling obligations? Catherine shook her head, though she wasn't sure if she was disagreeing with his words or trying to clear her thoughts. You're talking about destroying 3 marriages, traumatizing 4 children, and creating a constitutional crisis. All for what? A feeling that might be nothing more than infatuation. Is that what you think this is? Charles asked, his voice dropping to an intimate whisper. Infatuation? Before Catherine could answer, Charles leaned closer, and she felt the full impact of his presence, his warmth, his scent, the intensity of his focus on her. For a moment, the rest of the world seemed to fall away, and she could almost imagine what it would be like to simply surrender to whatever was building between them. I think, Catherine said carefully, that we're both under a great deal of stress, and that stress can sometimes make us confuse one feeling for another. You're probably right, Charles agreed, but he didn't move away. Stress can certainly affect our judgment, but stress can also strip away pretense and force us to confront truths we've been avoiding. The sound of footsteps in the hallway outside the study broke the moment's spell. Catherine quickly stepped away from Charles, moving back toward the desk and the abandoned environmental documents. Charles straightened his jacket and turned toward the window, putting distance between them just as the study door opened. Sorry to interrupt, William said, though his tone suggested he wasn't particularly sorry. Catherine, the children are asking for you. I thought we should be heading home. Catherine nodded quickly, grateful for the interruption even as she felt a strange sense of loss at the abrupt end to her conversation with Charles. Of course, I was just finishing up here. William's eyes moved between his wife and his father, taking in Catherine's flushed cheeks and Charles's carefully neutral expression. The environmental documents on the desk remained exactly where they had been when William had left the room earlier, suggesting that very little actual work had been accomplished during their private meeting. Find anything interesting in the proposals? William asked, his question directed at Catherine, but his eyes on his father. They're very thorough, Catherine replied, gathering her things quickly. I'll need some time to review them properly before offering detailed feedback. Charles watched as Catherine prepared to leave, memorizing the graceful way she moved, the careful composure she maintained even under stress. When she glanced at him before heading toward the door, the look that passed between them was brief but charged with unfinished business. Catherine, Charles said as she reached the doorway. Thank you for your time today. Your insights are always valuable. Thank you, Your Majesty, Catherine replied formally, but her voice carried undertones that William didn't miss. As Catherine and William left the study together, Charles remained by the window, watching their car disappear down the long drive. The conversation had crossed lines that could never be uncrossed, and he knew that everything between them would be different from this point forward. Down the corridor, Camilla stood in the shadow of an alcove, having overheard enough of the departing conversation to confirm her worst fears. The time for subtle observation had passed. Action would need to be taken, and it would need to happen soon, before her husband's growing obsession with their daughter-in-law destroyed everything she had worked so hard to achieve. The game had begun in earnest, and the stakes had never been higher. The days following the encounter in Charles's study passed with agonizing slowness for all involved. Catherine found herself unable to shake the memory of Charles's words, the intensity in his eyes, the way her heart had raced when he touched her face. She threw herself into her royal duties with renewed vigor, hoping that activity would quiet the confusion in her mind. But Charles's presence seemed to hover at the edges of every event, every meeting, every quiet moment. William noticed the change in his wife immediately. Catherine had always been composed and professional, but now there was a brittleness to her perfection, a forced quality to her smiles that hadn't been there before. She was more distant at home, often lost in thought during dinner conversations with the children, and when William tried to discuss the subtle shift in her behavior, she deflected with talk of work pressures and upcoming engagements. "You've been different since that meeting at Windsor," William said one evening as they prepared for bed in their Kensington Palace apartment. "Did something happen during your discussion with my father?" Catherine paused in brushing her hair, meeting his eyes in the mirror. "Nothing happened. We reviewed the environmental proposals, just as he said." "Why would you think otherwise?" "Because you've barely been able to look me in the eye since then," William replied, moving to stand behind her. "And because my father has been asking about your schedule with increasing frequency." The observation sent a chill through Catherine. She had been so focused on managing her own response to Charles's confession that she hadn't considered how her behavior might appear to others, or how Charles's behavior might be changing as well. "He's probably just trying to coordinate upcoming engagements," Catherine said, but even she could hear the uncertainty in her voice. William placed his hands on her shoulders, studying her reflection in the mirror. "Catherine, if there's something going on, something that's making you uncomfortable, you need to tell me. My father he's been under enormous pressure since becoming king. Sometimes that pressure can manifest in unexpected ways." Catherine turned to face him, seeing genuine concern in his eyes along with something that might have been suspicion. The idea that William was beginning to suspect something filled her with panic, not just for herself, but for what it would mean for the entire family. "William," she said, reaching up to touch his face, "there's nothing going on that you need to worry about. Your father has been nothing but appropriate in all our interactions. If I seem distracted, it's only because I'm trying to balance so many different responsibilities right now." William searched her face for signs of deception, but Catherine had learned to school her expressions well during her years as a royal. He wanted to believe her, needed to believe her, because the alternative was too disturbing to contemplate seriously. "All right," he said finally, though his tone suggested the conversation was far from over. "But, Catherine, if anything ever makes you uncomfortable, anything at all, you would tell me, wouldn't you?" "Of course," Catherine replied, hating herself for the lie even as she spoke it. Meanwhile, 3 floors above them in the same palace, Camilla sat in her private sitting room with a cup of tea growing cold at her elbow and a telephone in her hand. She had spent the better part of the evening making discreet inquiries among her network of friends and advisors, trying to determine the best way to handle what she increasingly viewed as a crisis. The conversation she had overheard outside Charles's study had confirmed her suspicions, but it had also revealed how far things had already progressed. Charles wasn't simply developing a passing attraction to Catherine. He was emotionally invested in a way that threatened not just his marriage, but the stability of the monarchy itself. "Margaret," Camilla said when her oldest friend finally answered the phone, "I need to speak with you about a delicate matter. Can you come by tomorrow afternoon?" Margaret Ashworth had been Camilla's confidant through decades of scandal and triumph. She had helped navigate the years when Camilla was considered the most hated woman in Britain, and she had been instrumental in crafting the careful campaign that had eventually led to public acceptance of Camilla as queen consort. "Of course, darling," Margaret replied, hearing the tension in her friend's voice. "Is everything all right?" "I'm not sure," Camilla admitted. "Charles has been distracted lately. There are some concerns I need to discuss with someone I trust." Margaret understood immediately that this was not a conversation for the telephone. "I'll be there at 2 o'clock. Shall I bring the files from the Australia campaign, in case we need to discuss precedents for handling delicate situations?" "Yes," Camilla said gratefully. "That would be very helpful." The next afternoon, Margaret arrived at Kensington Palace carrying a briefcase full of crisis management strategies that had been developed over the years to handle various royal emergencies. She was a small, elegant woman in her 60s with steel-gray hair and the kind of sharp intelligence that had made her invaluable to several members of the royal family over the decades. "Tell me everything," Margaret said once they were settled in Camilla's sitting room with the door firmly closed. Camilla recounted the changes she had observed in Charles's behavior, the overheard conversation fragments, and her growing certainty that her husband was developing serious feelings for Catherine. Margaret listened without interruption, occasionally taking notes in her neat handwriting. "How serious do you think this has become?" Margaret asked when Camilla finished her account. "I don't think there's been any physical impropriety yet," Camilla replied carefully. "But emotionally, I think Charles is more invested than he's ever been in any relationship, including ours." Margaret set down her pen and regarded her friend with sympathy. "That must be incredibly painful for you." "Pain I can handle," Camilla said crisply. "What I cannot handle is watching Charles destroy himself and the monarchy for what amounts to an impossible fantasy. Catherine will never leave William, and even if she would consider it, the constitutional implications would be catastrophic. So what do you propose to do about it?" Camilla pulled out a folder she had prepared earlier. "I've been thinking about this very carefully. Direct confrontation with Charles would only make him defensive and potentially push him toward more reckless behavior. Confronting Catherine directly would put her in an impossible position and might backfire if she's more emotionally involved than I think she is. Which leaves indirect intervention," Camilla said, opening the folder to reveal a detailed plan. "We need to create circumstances that naturally increase the distance between Charles and Catherine while giving them both face-saving reasons for that distance." Margaret studied the documents with professional interest. "You're proposing to essentially restructure their official responsibilities to minimize contact." "Among other things," Camilla confirmed. "Charles has been looking for ways to expand Catherine's role in environmental initiatives because it gives him excuses to work with her directly. What if we were to suggest that Catherine's talents would be better utilized in areas where her unique background would be more valuable, education, perhaps, or children's mental health? And, conveniently, those areas fall more naturally under William's purview than Charles's," Margaret observed. "Exactly. We present it as a strategic decision to maximize the effectiveness of their individual strengths rather than an attempt to separate them." Margaret made additional notes as Camilla outlined the various elements of her strategy. "This could work," she said finally, "but it will require very careful timing and presentation. Charles is intelligent enough to see through a ham-handed attempt at manipulation, which is why we won't present it as our idea at all," Camilla said with a slight smile. "The suggestion will come from the Archbishop of Canterbury, who has been concerned about the need to modernize the monarchy's approach to social issues. Charles respects his opinion enormously and would be unlikely to question his motivations. And the Archbishop would be willing to cooperate with this plan? He doesn't need to know the real reason behind it," Camilla explained. "The suggestions we'll ask him to make are genuinely good ideas for modernizing royal responsibilities. The fact that they also serve our purposes is simply a happy coincidence." Margaret nodded approvingly. "Plausible deniability all around. What about the scheduling conflicts? It's one thing to change official responsibilities, but Charles will find other reasons to seek Catherine's input if he's determined to do so. That's where the second phase comes in," Camilla said, turning to another section of her folder. "Charles has been wanting to expand his overseas travel since becoming king, particularly to Commonwealth countries where his presence as the new monarch would be meaningful. I'm going to encourage those impulses and volunteer to accompany him on extended tours, removing him from the immediate environment entirely, for several weeks at a time, multiple times throughout the year. It will give him perspective and eliminate the daily temptations that are feeding his current obsession." Margaret studied the timeline Camilla had prepared. "This is quite comprehensive. You've thought of almost everything. But what if Catherine is more emotionally involved than you believe? What if removing Charles from her daily life only intensifies whatever feelings she might be developing?" Camilla had considered this possibility, and it was the aspect of her plan that worried her most. If Catherine is truly developing feelings for Charles, then we have a much more serious problem than I initially thought. But I don't believe that's the case. I think Charles is projecting his own desires onto their interactions and misinterpreting her natural kindness and professional courtesy as something more personal. And if I'm wrong, then we'll need to move to more direct interventions. But I prefer to exhaust the subtle approaches first." Margaret closed her notebook and regarded Camilla with admiration. "You've learned a great deal about crisis management over the years." "I've had excellent teachers," Camilla replied wryly, "and plenty of practice." As the two women continued to refine their strategy, Neither of them was aware that Catherine was at that very moment sitting in her car in the palace parking area, staring at her phone and debating whether to answer a text message from Charles. The message was innocuous enough, a question about her thoughts on a proposed children's literacy program. But Catherine could read the subtext behind his words. She had been avoiding Charles since their conversation in his study, declining invitations to private meetings, and keeping their interactions limited to large group settings where personal conversation would be impossible. But the distance she was trying to maintain only seemed to intensify the connection she felt to him, making their brief public encounters charged with unspoken communication. Finally, Catherine typed a brief, professional response to Charles's message, then immediately deleted it and typed another. After 3 attempts, she settled on, "The literacy program looks very promising. I'd be happy to review the details when my schedule permits." The response was carefully neutral, but Catherine knew that Charles would read the phrase, "when my schedule permits," as an opening, a suggestion that she was willing to meet with him privately again despite her recent avoidance. Charles, who had been waiting anxiously for her response, felt a surge of hope when he read her message. He immediately began composing a reply suggesting a specific time and place for their discussion, then stopped himself. He was being too eager, too obvious in his desire to see her. Instead, he sent back a simple, "Wonderful. I'll have my secretary coordinate with yours." But even as he tried to maintain appropriate professional distance in his communication, Charles was already thinking about how he could arrange their next meeting to be as private and intimate as possible. The conversation in his study had awakened something in him that he couldn't ignore, and Catherine's continued presence in his life felt both like a gift and a torment. Neither Charles nor Catherine realized that their text exchange was being monitored by palace security as a matter of routine, or that the frequency and timing of their communications had already been flagged by alert staff members who were paid to notice unusual patterns in royal behavior. The wheels of palace intrigue were beginning to turn, and the stakes were rising higher with each passing day. 3 weeks after Camilla had set her plan in motion, the first phase was beginning to show results. The Archbishop of Canterbury had indeed suggested a restructuring of royal responsibilities, presenting it to Charles as a progressive approach to modernizing the monarchy's social impact. Charles had agreed, though with obvious reluctance when he realized the implications for his working relationship with Catherine. Catherine found herself assigned to a major education initiative that would require extensive travel throughout England and Wales, visiting schools and meeting with education officials. The work was meaningful and aligned perfectly with her genuine interests, but she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being deliberately kept busy and away from Kensington Palace. "The new assignment is perfect for you," William said one morning as they shared breakfast before their respective days' engagements. "Education has always been one of your strongest interests, and this gives you a platform to really make a difference." Catherine nodded, spreading marmalade on her toast with perhaps more concentration than the task required. "Yes, it's a wonderful opportunity. I just wonder why the decision was made so suddenly. Last month your father was eager to have me involved in the environmental initiatives, and now suddenly, those are being handled by someone else entirely." William looked up from his newspaper, noting the slight edge in his wife's voice. "Does it matter? You've always said you wanted more autonomy in choosing your charitable focus." "You're right," Catherine agreed, though something about the timing still bothered her. "I suppose I'm just overthinking it." What Catherine didn't know was that Charles had spent the previous evening in his study, staring at the new organizational chart that effectively removed most of his official reasons for working closely with her. He had called Camilla into the room to discuss what he saw as a problematic separation of their various initiatives. "This doesn't make sense," Charles had said, pointing to the new structure. "Catherine's environmental background makes her invaluable for the sustainability projects. Moving her entirely to education creates an artificial divide that weakens both programs." Camilla had listened patiently to his arguments, recognizing them for what they were: protests against losing his primary avenue for spending time with Catherine rather than genuine concerns about organizational efficiency. The Archbishop made some very compelling points about maximizing individual strengths, Camilla had replied carefully. "And Catherine's education background really is quite impressive. I think this restructuring will allow her to shine in ways that weren't possible when her efforts were divided between multiple causes." Charles had continued to argue, but Camilla had deflected each of his points with reasonable counterarguments that made it impossible for him to object without revealing his true motivations. Eventually, he had been forced to accept the new arrangement, though his displeasure was obvious. Now, a week into the new structure, Charles found himself looking for other excuses to interact with Catherine. He began attending events that weren't strictly necessary for him to attend, appearing at education-related functions where Catherine was speaking, and requesting updates on programs that fell outside his official purview. Catherine noticed his increased presence at her events, and, despite her efforts to maintain professional distance, she found herself looking for him in the crowds, feeling a flutter of anticipation when she spotted him in the audience. Their interactions remained strictly public and appropriate, but there was an undercurrent of tension that seemed to grow stronger with each encounter. The situation came to a head during a literacy fundraising gala at the Royal Festival Hall. Catherine was the keynote speaker, delivering a passionate address about the importance of early childhood reading programs. Charles sat in the front row, ostensibly there in his capacity as patron of several educational charities, but his attention was focused entirely on Catherine rather than her message. As Catherine spoke about the transformative power of education, Charles found himself captivated not just by her words, but by her presence. She wore a midnight blue gown that seemed to shimmer under the stage lights, and her voice carried a conviction that spoke to her genuine commitment to the cause. When she smiled at a particularly moving anecdote about a child she had met during her school visits, Charles felt his heart race in a way that had nothing to do with paternal pride or professional admiration. After the formal program concluded, the reception provided an opportunity for guests to mingle with the royal attendees. Charles positioned himself strategically near the entrance to the reception hall, ensuring that Catherine would have to pass near him as she made her rounds greeting supporters. When she approached, Catherine offered the same gracious smile she had been giving all evening, but Charles noticed that her eyes held his gaze a fraction longer than necessary. "Your speech was remarkable," Charles said, moving slightly closer as other guests swirled around them. "Your passion for this work is truly inspiring." "Thank you, Your Majesty," Catherine replied, conscious that they were being watched by dozens of people, including several photographers. "The work speaks for itself, really. These programs make such a tangible difference in children's lives. Would you have a moment to discuss expanding the program to include some of the Commonwealth countries?" Charles asked. "I know it's outside your current purview, but your insights would be invaluable as we plan next year's overseas initiatives." Catherine hesitated. The question was reasonable on its face, but she could see the hope in Charles's eyes that went beyond professional consultation. "Perhaps we could schedule a meeting through the proper channels," she said diplomatically. "Of course," Charles agreed, but then lowered his voice slightly. "Though I confess I value our informal discussions more than the formal briefings. You have a way of cutting through bureaucratic nonsense to get to the heart of what really matters." The compliment was delivered with such sincerity that Catherine felt heat rise in her cheeks. Before she could respond, William appeared at her elbow with perfect timing. "Father," William said, placing a protective hand on Catherine's lower back, "wonderful to see you here. Catherine's work on this literacy initiative has been absolutely remarkable." "Indeed it has," Charles replied, noting the possessive gesture and the slight emphasis William placed on Catherine's work, as if reminding his father of the boundaries that should exist. "We should probably circulate," William continued smoothly. "There are several major donors Catherine hasn't had a chance to speak with yet." As William guided Catherine away, Charles remained where he stood, watching them move through the crowd together. He observed the easy way they interacted with donors and other guests, the practiced coordination of a couple who had spent years perfecting their public partnership. Yet he also noticed that Catherine glanced back at him twice, and each glance felt like a small victory. Camilla, who had been watching the entire interaction from across the room, approached Charles with 2 glasses of champagne. "Successful evening," she commented, offering him one of the glasses. "Yes," Charles agreed absently, his attention still focused on Catherine and William. "Very successful. The literacy program really is quite impressive," Camilla continued. "Catherine has found her niche, hasn't she? It's wonderful to see her so engaged in work that's clearly her calling." Charles turned to study his wife's face, looking for any sign of the manipulation he was beginning to suspect. But Camilla's expression was perfectly neutral, conveying nothing but appropriate support for Catherine's charitable work. "Yes," Charles said again, "she's remarkable." "She certainly is," Camilla agreed. "Which is why I think she'll be so excited about the opportunity that's just come up." Charles felt a chill of apprehension. "What opportunity?" "The Department for Education has requested that she lead a comprehensive tour of schools throughout Scotland and Northern Ireland," Camilla explained. It's a 6-week assignment that would really establish her as the leading royal voice on educational issues. The timing works perfectly with the new organizational structure. 6 weeks, Charles repeated, his dismay obvious despite his efforts to control his reaction. It's a tremendous honor, Camilla said. And the timing couldn't be better, since you'll be occupied with the Commonwealth tour during the same period. Charles stared at his wife, finally, seeing the pattern clearly. The restructuring of responsibilities, the geographical separation of their assignments, the timing that ensured they would be apart for extended periods. None of it was coincidental. When did you know? He asked quietly. Know what? Camilla replied, though her tone suggested she understood exactly what he was asking. When did you realize what was happening between Catherine and me? Camilla set down her champagne glass and met her husband's gaze directly. I realized you were developing feelings for her weeks ago. What I didn't realize until tonight was how far those feelings had progressed. Charles felt exposed, vulnerable in a way he hadn't experienced since the early days of his relationship with Camilla herself. And so you decided to take action. I decided to protect our marriage and your reputation, Camilla replied calmly. Which, incidentally, also protects Catherine and William, whether they realize it or not. By manipulating us all. By preventing you from making a catastrophic mistake, Camilla corrected. Charles, I understand that you're feeling something powerful for Catherine. I even understand why. She's lovely, intelligent, caring, and she treats you with genuine respect and affection. But what you're contemplating would destroy everything we've all worked to build. Charles wanted to argue, but the rational part of his mind recognized the truth in Camilla's words. So what happens now? You continue to engineer our separation until these feelings fade. I hope that distance and time will help you gain perspective, Camilla said. And I hope that when you do, you'll remember that what we have together is worth preserving. Across the room, Catherine was engaged in conversation with a group of education ministers, but she could feel the intensity of the discussion taking place between Charles and Camilla. When she glanced in their direction, she saw Charles looking directly at her with an expression that seemed to combine longing and resignation in equal measure. The moment stretched between them across the crowded room, loaded with unspoken words and impossible possibilities. Then, Charles raised his champagne glass in a slight salute. Whether to her accomplishments that evening or to something deeper, Catherine couldn't be sure. She lifted her own glass in response, and the gesture felt like both a toast and a goodbye. 2 hours later, as guests began to depart, Catherine found herself alone in the ladies' room, staring at her reflection in the ornate mirror. The successful evening should have left her feeling triumphant, but instead she felt hollow, as if something important had ended without her permission. Her phone buzzed with a text message, and her heart jumped, hoping irrationally that it might be from Charles. Instead, it was from William. Car is waiting outside when you're ready. Brilliant evening. You were perfect as always. Catherine typed back, thank you. Out in 2 minutes. Then, stared at the message before sending it. William's praise felt dutiful rather than passionate, appropriate rather than heartfelt. She wondered when their communications had become so polite and efficient, lacking the warmth and intimacy that had once characterized their relationship. As she prepared to leave, Catherine made a decision that surprised her with its clarity. Tomorrow she would request a private meeting with Charles, ostensibly to discuss the Commonwealth education initiatives he had mentioned. She would use the meeting to address the growing tension between them directly, to establish clear boundaries that would allow them both to fulfill their duties without the emotional complications that were becoming increasingly dangerous. What Catherine didn't know was that Charles was at that very moment composing a text message to her, requesting exactly the same meeting for exactly the same purpose. Both of them believed they had the strength to resist temptation if they could just speak honestly about what was happening between them. Neither of them realized how wrong they were about to be. The meeting was arranged for the following Tuesday afternoon at Clarence's house, Charles's private residence. Catherine had chosen the location deliberately, believing that the formal setting would help maintain appropriate boundaries during what she anticipated would be a difficult conversation. Charles had agreed to the venue, though privately he preferred the intimacy it would provide compared to the more public spaces of Buckingham Palace or Windsor Castle. Catherine arrived exactly on time, dressed in a conservative charcoal gray suit that she hoped would convey professionalism and seriousness. She was escorted to Charles's private study, a book-lined room that felt both grand and personal, filled with artifacts from his decades of public service and private interests. Charles rose from behind his desk as she entered, noting how the afternoon light streaming through the tall windows seemed to create a halo effect around her hair. He had spent the morning trying to prepare himself for this conversation, rehearsing the words he would use to explain his feelings while establishing the boundaries they both knew were necessary. "Catherine," he said, gesturing toward the seating area near the fireplace rather than the more formal chairs facing his desk. "Thank you for coming. I know your schedule has been incredibly demanding lately." "Thank you for making the time to see me," Catherine replied, choosing to sit in the chair rather than on the sofa where Charles had seated himself. The physical distance felt necessary, though she immediately noticed how his face fell slightly at her choice. For a moment, they sat in silence, each waiting for the other to begin a conversation that neither wanted to have. Finally, Charles leaned forward, his hands clasped between his knees. "Catherine, I think we need to address what's been happening between us," he said quietly. "The tension, the feelings, the way we've been circling around something that can't be ignored anymore." Catherine nodded, grateful that he had taken the lead in broaching the difficult subject. "I agree. The situation has become complicated in ways that aren't healthy for anyone involved." "Complicated," Charles repeated with a bitter laugh. "That's certainly one way to describe it. Though I think devastating might be more accurate, at least from my perspective." The raw honesty in his voice made Catherine's chest tighten with sympathy, and something else she didn't want to examine too closely. "Charles, I need you to understand that whatever you think you've seen from me, whatever encouragement you believe I've given you, it wasn't intentional. I never meant to lead you to believe that there could be anything between us beyond family relationship and professional cooperation." Charles studied her face carefully, looking for signs of the deception he hoped to find. If Catherine was lying, if she did feel something for him but was simply being responsible about it, then his feelings weren't the one-sided obsession that Camilla clearly believed them to be. "Are you saying you feel nothing?" he asked directly. "That all of our conversations, all of the moments when I felt such a strong connection between us, were entirely my imagination?" Catherine hesitated, and in that hesitation, Charles found the answer he was both hoping for and dreading. She did feel something. The question was how much, and whether it was enough to build something real or simply enough to make them both miserable. "I'm saying that what I feel doesn't matter," Catherine replied carefully. "I'm married to your son. I have children who depend on the stability of our family. I have duties and responsibilities that require me to put personal desires aside." "That's not what I asked," Charles pressed gently. "I asked if you feel nothing." Catherine closed her eyes for a moment, struggling with the temptation to lie, to deny everything, and create the distance they both needed. But something about Charles's vulnerability, his willingness to expose his own feelings so completely, made deception feel like a betrayal of something precious. "No," she said finally, opening her eyes to meet his gaze directly. "I don't feel nothing." The admission hung in the air between them like a physical presence. Charles felt a surge of vindication and desire that was immediately followed by the crushing weight of impossibility. Catherine felt relief at having spoken the truth, and terror at what that truth might lead to. "Then, we're both in the same impossible situation," Charles said softly, feeling something real and meaningful and completely forbidden. Catherine stood abruptly, moving toward the window as if physical movement could help her escape the emotional trap she felt closing around her. "Which is exactly why this conversation is necessary. We need to find a way to manage these feelings without allowing them to destroy our lives." Charles rose and followed her, though he stopped just close enough that she could feel his presence behind her. "What if we don't want to manage them?" he asked quietly. "What if we want to explore them, to see where they might lead?" Catherine turned to face him, and found herself closer to him than she had intended. "Then, we would be selfish and destructive and foolish. We would be putting our own desires ahead of our children's welfare, ahead of our duties to the crown, ahead of everything we claim to believe in." "Would we?" Charles asked, reaching out to touch her face as he had in his study weeks earlier. This time, Catherine didn't pull away. "Or would we be choosing authenticity over pretense, genuine feeling over social convention?" Catherine felt herself leaning into his touch despite every rational thought screaming at her to step away. "Charles, please don't make this harder than it already is." "I'm not trying to make it hard," Charles said, moving closer until they were nearly touching. "I'm trying to understand why two people who care for each other, who could make each other happy, should sacrifice that happiness to maintain appearances." "Because appearances matter in our world," Catherine replied, though her voice lacked conviction. Because the monarchy depends on stability and respectability. Because we have responsibilities that go far beyond our personal desires. The monarchy, Charles repeated with frustration. Always the monarchy. What about us, Catherine? What about what we want, what we need, what we could have together? Before Catherine could respond, Charles closed the remaining distance between them and kissed her. It wasn't a gentle, tentative kiss, but one filled with weeks of suppressed longing and desire. For a moment, Catherine was too shocked to respond. Then, despite every warning her rational mind was screaming, she found herself kissing him back. The kiss lasted only a few seconds, but it changed everything. When they broke apart, both were breathing hard, and the room seemed charged with electricity. "We can't do this," Catherine whispered, though she made no move to step away from him. "We just did," Charles replied, his hands moving to frame her face. And it felt right in a way that nothing has felt right in years. Catherine closed her eyes, struggling against the desire to surrender to whatever was building between them. One kiss doesn't change anything. It doesn't make this possible or right or anything other than a mistake we need to forget. Doesn't it? Charles asked, leaning his forehead against hers. Catherine, when was the last time you felt truly alive? When was the last time someone looked at you the way I'm looking at you right now? When was the last time you felt desired rather than simply appreciated? The questions hit too close to home. Catherine's marriage to William had settled into a comfortable routine that provided stability and partnership, but little passion. She couldn't remember the last time William had looked at her with anything approaching the intensity she saw in Charles's eyes. "That's not fair," Catherine said weakly. "Fair," Charles repeated. "Nothing about this situation is fair. It's not fair that I found the woman I was meant to be with 20 years too late. It's not fair that you're married to someone who takes your devotion for granted. It's not fair that we're both trapped in lives that fulfill our duties, but not our hearts." Catherine opened her eyes and found Charles watching her with such tenderness that her resolve began to crumble. "What are you suggesting? That we have an affair? That we sneak around behind William's back and Camilla's back and pretend that we can manage the guilt and the lies and the constant risk of discovery?" "I'm suggesting that we stop pretending we can ignore what's between us," Charles said. "I'm suggesting that we find a way to be together, even if it's complicated, even if it requires difficult conversations and painful adjustments." "You're talking about destroying 2 marriages and devastating our children," Catherine said, but her voice held more sadness than anger. "I'm talking about choosing happiness over duty for once in our lives," Charles replied. "I'm talking about refusing to sacrifice the most meaningful connection either of us has ever felt to maintain a status quo that's making us both miserable." Catherine pulled back slightly, though she didn't break free of his embrace entirely. "Charles, even if we could find a way to be together without destroying everything else in our lives, what makes you think it would work? What makes you think this isn't just infatuation or escapism or a midlife crisis that would burn itself out once the novelty wore off?" "Because of this," Charles said, kissing her again, more gently this time but with no less intensity. "Because of the way I feel when I'm with you. The way you make me believe that I could be better than I am. The way everything else in my life makes sense when you're part of it." This time, Catherine didn't resist. She allowed herself to melt into the kiss, to feel the full force of the connection she had been fighting for weeks. When they separated, she was trembling. "This is madness," she whispered. "Yes," Charles agreed, pulling her closer. "But it's the most sane I've felt in decades." At that moment, the study door opened without warning. Camilla entered, followed by William, both of them stopping dead at the sight of Charles and Catherine in each other's arms. The silence that followed was deafening, charged with shock, betrayal, and the shattering of carefully maintained illusions. Catherine jerked away from Charles as if she had been burned, her face flooding with mortification. Charles straightened, but made no attempt to deny what they had all clearly witnessed. William's face went through a rapid succession of emotions: confusion, disbelief, hurt, and, finally, cold fury. "Well," Camilla said finally, her voice deadly calm, "I think we all know where we stand now." The room fell silent in shock, and, in that silence, the future of the British royal family hung in the balance, forever changed by a moment of passion that could no longer be hidden or denied.